Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 8 of the Exodus seminar. Today, we're going to walk through chapters 18, 19, and 20. 18, where Moses sits as judge upon his people. 19, the initial events at Mount Sinai. And then 20, the Ten Commandments. And that will bring the first half of the Exodus seminar to a close. To pick up again, it's November, or it's August 2022 at the moment. We'll pick up again in January 2023 and hopefully bring it to a close, as well as introducing some of the subsidiary narrative in some of the other biblical chapters. I'll just briefly run through the participants. We have a slight change in lineup today. We lost one participant and gained another. On my left, I have Oz Guinness, James Orr, Dennis Prager, Stephen Blackwood, Jonathan Paggio, and our new participant today, Dr. Larry Arnn, who is president of a wonderful educational institution, Hillsdale College, who's also been down in Miami filming a course on Churchill for Peterson Academy. So Dr. Arnn, thank you very much for extending your stay to participate today, and just let you to say a few more words about yourself, if you'd be kind enough to do that.
I'm here as a man who's learned to do what Jordan Peterson tells him to do. And proud to do it, and wonderful to be with you all.
Thank you, thank you. All right, so away we go. We'll start with Exodus 18:1, since one is always a good place to start. When Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, and that the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt, then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back, and her 2 sons, of which the name of the one was Gershom, for he said, I have been an alien in a strange land. And the name of the other was Eleazar. For the God of my father said he was mine help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. These names in the biblical context obviously have the broader meaning that's attributed to them in the text. It's confusing if you don't know the names, but that's the reason. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife unto Moses into the wilderness.
Forgive me, I'll explain the word, and it'll be very interesting.
Please do.
So Eliezer, El is God. Israel is a struggle with God. So El is known to most people who study the Bible. Eli, as in Eliezer, is my God. Ezer, I'm only pointing this out because it's very interesting. Ezer is helpmate. It is the exact same word used for Eve in the creation to Adam. So it is a big deal to be an Ezer. It is not. It doesn't diminish Eve's status, as some claim, to say that she is a helpmate. Because anyway, the next word means equal to him. But I just want to. So Eliezer, my God, helps me, or is my helper.
And that's one of his sons. And what do you think is there a particular symbolic significance of the name Gershom? That's often famously translated as stranger in a strange land.
Well, that's what I mean. Ger is the word whenever the Bible uses love the stranger. It is ger, as I pointed out, means really resident alien. Right. And sham just means there.
Right. And so this, the stranger in a strange land is also represented in the narrative context here as one of Moses' sons. Yeah. So something very
It's like
close
the transition itself. You can see in the name of his 2 sons the difference between the time in Egypt and now this new period that they're going through.
So that's echoed as well.
Yeah, like a little microcosm is in his own family of what the whole story of Israel is.
Like your family is a microcosm of the current events in the society, inevitably. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife unto Moses in the wilderness, where he encamped at the mount of God. And he said unto Moses, I, thy father-in-law Jethro, am come unto thee, and thy wife, and her 2 sons with her. And Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, and did obeisance, and kissed him. And they asked each other of their welfare, and they came into the tent. And Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done unto Pharaoh. So what have you been up to, Moses? It's like, well, there was a sequence of plagues, and there's this whole Red Sea thing. How about you, Jethro? Yeah. And how's every little thing? Yeah. And Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done unto Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and all the travail that had come upon them by the way, and how the Lord delivered them. And Jethro rejoiced for all the goodness which the Lord had done to Israel, whom he had delivered out of the hands of the Egyptians. And Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord, who hath delivered you out of the hands of Egyptians, and out of the hand of Pharaoh, who hath delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Okay, so now he's a priest of the Midians. So what's he so happy about the Lord working on Israel's behalf for? Does that seem, how distant the people were the Midians?
Well, I think it's a deliberate contrast. I mean, we've seen throughout Exodus that it's often the Gentiles, it's the non-Jews who are cast in a favourable light, as a point that Dennis made earlier in the week. So, and there might also be, I think, because it's this strange intrusion of this story in chapter 18. I mean, it's just a real break from the narrative. Right. And I think similar events are described in Numbers and even Deuteronomy, where it's after the events on Sinai. So it's an odd, from a narratival point of view, that this has just been kind of inserted in here, like it almost sticks out.
But
like
you think at least it's in part this emphasis that the foreigner is capable of recognizing that this is a benevolent sequence of occurrences, and even more than Israel, maybe.
Yeah, and he recognizes it more quickly than Israel. I think that's the point. It's like an immediate acknowledgement and an immediate response. There's a kind of irony there.
Right.
Yeah, but I also think it's important for Moses to be reconciled with his family as he now leaves Egypt. And so it's also a little image of this reconciliation which is preparing itself.
And the rebuilding?
Yeah.
Right, so it's the reestablishment of the state, but part of that is the reestablishment. That makes sense because Moses is reunited with his family, and then he starts to sit as judge for the people, which is a very crucial part of this story from a psychological perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it puts the family in an extraordinary position. I mean, bearing in mind the importance of the way in which parents and
the father-in-law
in the Ten Commandments later on, it's very significant. I think that the phrase "father-in-law," the word is repeated again and again and again.
So this is the part of the proper reordering of the world.
But another way of seeing it, liberation. And then you've got in 19 and 20 people formation. And the covenant is the key event in the people formation. But as I understand the Jewish understanding of this, you've got these three events in the middle which show the necessity of dealing with the necessities. And number one is sustenance. They need the quails and water. Number two is protection from external enemies. And number three, we're coming to, you need some primitive ordering, administration.
And that starts here with the family.
Starts here with
but
Jethro.
also with what Jethro is going to recommend.
Right. And it's very interesting
but
that it's Jethro who recommends
his system is not enough.
No.
And what the Lord gives in the covenant is richer, deeper than anything that Jethro brings in. And that's how I see it, these three things.
Yeah, I think that's right. There may be a contrast too with Amalek. So it's as if the Gentiles are presented both as foe and as friend. And that will be the story of Israel, of course, the constant.
So that the Gentiles aren't automatically enemies. They can see Jethro says next, now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, for in the thing wherein they dealt proudly, he was above them.
Yeah.
So
I think they're types. Amalek is a type of the hostility and enmity shown towards Israel, and Jethro is effectively the sign,
the wise foreigner.
Type of the wise foreigner, the friend,
and we'll
the Gentile
see that
who welcomes Israel.
Continue all through the story up to King Cyrus.
And it started, of course, in the second chapter when Moses helped the daughters of Jethro water their flocks because he fought off the shepherds. And when they got home, he said, "Why are you back so early today?" And they said, "Well, this Egyptian came in." And
Jethro asked,
and he says, "Well, where is he? How have you not called him in to have dinner with us?" Yeah. And so there's already the wisdom of acknowledging the
hospitality.
Yes.
So Jethro is being presented continually as the benevolent foreigner.
Yeah, and wise.
Of high moral order.
The family...
After you, Dennis.
All right, thank you. It's just a note, a non-theological note. Clearly, Moses was not with his family this whole time. And there's an implication, I think, in the Torah text that his children did not amount to much. We hear nothing about them ever, which is very rare in the Torah.
So it was a sacrifice, in some sense, on Moses' part and his family.
Right. Well, on the family's part, certainly. Yeah. It's actually a little sad. The whole question of can great men produce normal children is just, I guess, an open question.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But there's another addition. The prophets don't have sons, do they? The priests have sons who succeed them. The prophets don't.
Right.
They're one off.
Well, God appoints prophets, whereas
Right, so it's not
genealogy
part of the
appoints
lineage.
priests. Yeah.
And there's
Right,
a lot
and
of
you
comment
need to
here.
cards.
I mean, Moses kisses his father-in-law, sort of masculine greeting. There's no mention of any endearment with his wife. And people have made the point you said, that he was the father to the nation almost, not particularly
yes.
to his own family.
Normal for a man to try to impress his father-in-law.
Yeah, well, he seems to have done a pretty good job on this front. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God. And Aaron came and all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. I could just make a brief reference to the idea of burnt offering. I mean, the idea in this archaic sense, in some sense, is that, well, if you take the animal and you burn it, then the smoke rises, and God is that which is above, and so God can detect the smoke, and then he can detect the quality of the offering. So that's the idea behind the offering, and it is archaic. It's not the way that modern people think about sacrifice, but I think about it psychologically as a developmental move towards full recognition of the idea, first of all, that work is a form of sacrifice and vice versa, and that because you sacrifice the present to the future at least, but you also sacrifice everything to your highest priority, if you're not confused. And then that brings up the question of what the highest priority should be and what the quality of the sacrifice should be. And the answer to that psychologically is it should be the highest possible quality sacrifice to the highest possible thing, because otherwise you have to ask yourself, well, why would you bother doing it? So it's easy to dismiss these ideas of burnt offering as primitive superstition, but there's an idea behind them that's it's unbelievably deep and profound, and also the idea that life requires sacrifice to continue in its utmost form, and that the sacrifice should be voluntary, and that even it should extend in some sense, and has to the sacrifice of the innocent. I mean, that's an extremely profound and also very problematic idea, but it can't be just hand-waved away.
And there's a manner in which, if you take that fractally and you apply it to little things or to purposes in general, there's a manner in which the purpose will always know the quality of your sacrifice,
Right.
because what you do, the quality of what you do will attain or not the purpose.
Right.
But like the world will hit you back. You can pretend with people, you can lie, you can deceive, but if you're trying to be a good basketball player,
And you don't make
if you don't make the sacrifices, you're not going to be a good basketball player.
Yeah.
That's what's going to happen.
Yeah, well, and that's another indication of the intrinsic logos of the world. And we also know this deeply, I would say, inside ourselves, because people know perfectly well that their conscience can torment them. And it is the case sometimes that people's conscience is overdeveloped and has this tyrannical superego element and will knock them down. But if your conscience is functioning well, basically what it does is indicate to you constantly that your sacrifices are either not of the right sort or they're not of the highest quality. And you call yourself out on that, right? And so, and what's one of the things that's so odd about that is you can't. If you try to escape from that, it just makes it worse for you, and you know that, and you really can't escape from it, not except by abiding by it. You can fight it and all of that, and you can harden your heart and become even more determined in your willingness to make improper sacrifices, but you know perfectly well, I've never seen anyone that in some fundamental sense was deluded on that account. People know, they know, I could have tried harder.
By the way, is it your theory then, in light of all these days, and that subject of sacrifice. Do you feel that we are net losers religiously, morally, theologically, net gainers, or neither, having no more sacrificial system?
Well, I think we do still have a sacrificial system. I mean, I asked my students all the time in my Maps of Meaning class. A lot of them were children of first-generation immigrants, often Asian. I said, "What did your parents sacrifice to come here?" Well, it's like they knew exactly what that meant, and they knew exactly, generally, what they had sacrificed as well. And so we've spiritualized it in some sense, and partly what you see in the entire biblical corpus is the spiritualization, the psychologization of a sacrificial practice.
But very specifically, and I don't have an answer.
I mean, the fact that we don't act it out.
The actual carnal representation of sacrifice, is that a loss that we don't have that?
It's a very good question. I mean, part of the question that Jonathan and I have been debating back and forth constantly is, and part of the question that this book raises is, to what degree does what's become abstract still need to be represented in image and action, right?
Right.
How much does it have to be ritualized?
Yeah,
and
but
the
there
answer
is
is
still, I mean, in
know.
Jewish tradition, there is still, even though it's not a killing of an animal, there still is a ritualized aspect to the sacrifice. So there some kind of giving, like giving money or giving something, which becomes like a...
Judaism, the Torah and Judaism later are very concrete religions. It was even dismissed by some Christians in the Middle Ages as a carnal religion because it's so deeply embedded in life.
Practice.
Yes, the abstract is less important than the concrete in many ways in the Torah and in Judaism. But I'm asking this, I don't know if you know this, I'm sure Oz knows this, but many, many religious Jews still pray daily for the restoration of the sacrificial system, that the temple be rebuilt, and specifically so that we can sacrifice again. And
there's no denying the drama of blood and death.
Right. So you would not dismiss that prayer as odd.
I tend not to dismiss anything that's extraordinarily peculiar out of hand, right? Because there's usually something lurking underneath it. But I mean, in Christianity, obviously, you still have a sacrificial...
We believe we still have a sacrifice. We participate in the sacrifice of Christ.
Right.
It's not a...
It's
not a repeated sacrifice, though, isn't it?
It is a participation, a perfect memory in the participation of the sacrifice of Christ.
It is an unusual period. AD 70 is when it disappeared, isn't it?
Right. Destruction
of the temple. And they shifted from the temple to the synagogue, and from, if I understand it rightly, Dennis, from sacrifice
to prayer. Right.
And I always wonder, how does prayer fill in for sacrifice?
Well, hopefully when you pray, you sacrifice your own
for
tyrant,
atonement.
right? Because that's it.
Well, you sacrifice a lot of time
partly
to pray.
what you're saying is, I think if the prayer is proper, is you're saying, there's part of me that needs to go. There's part of me that I need to let go. There's part of me that needs to die, and it has to be given up to something higher. What part of it is of me has to go? And there's a contemplative aspect to that, and you look to the highest to help guide you in that. So there's a discriminating spirit within you that can help separate the chaff from the wheat, and the offering up of the chaff is the sacrificial gesture, and so that can be transformed into prayer. And one of the things that Jung would say about that, for example, is that if you give up enough psychologically, you don't have to. You'll cut your losses in actuality, and of course that's sort of what thought's for, is right, so that you can get yourself straight. You can give it up in abstraction, so you don't act out the pathology, and then nothing dies in actuality. But that still means you have something to give up, and part of that repentance idea is a sacrificial notion. It's like, well, oh, that's what I did wrong. Oh, that's a big part of me. Oh, it's going to hurt when that goes. It's like, yeah, but maybe you won't die. And then you offer it up as a sacrifice to something higher, because otherwise, why would you improve? And that discriminating spirit inside that judges what's in you that should be sacrificed, that wouldn't even exist unless it was existing in relationship to something higher, because there'd be nothing to serve as a judge. And so that's all reflective of something. If it's not a heavenly hierarchy, it's a bloody close approximation of one.
I've been wondering as we've been reading this whether the fundamental question we should be asking is whether Exodus is in a deep sense simply a depiction of reality itself. Like that, I think, is the claim of the text, right? And one of the ways we see this is in terms of sacrifice, that, as you said beautifully, in terms of parents, like there is no good family life without sacrifice. It's not optional, right? You have to make the sacrifices to your children for them to become what they're going to become. And so you might say that's just you might say embedded into the DNA of the real.
Well, you sacrifice all other women to your wife too.
And again, all of this. You talk about the basketball team. It's the same. It's fundamental into the DNA of reality itself. But there's another side to it, which I think Dennis is trying to call us towards, which is that yes, that is the nature of things, but if you don't do that consciously, you won't likely do that well. And so we see that one of the realities that the text is calling us towards is the importance of the consciousness of our own sacrifice, of our constant orientation.
By consciousness, do you mean acting it out? Like, 'cause there's consciousness at different levels, right? You can be conscious abstractly. Dennis's question was, how much do you have to act that out concretely?
I think Dennis's question is both. Of course, we saw yesterday this beautiful image that Jonathan and I were talking about this morning of Moses holding up the hands, as it were, the contemplative, the illumination, the revelation, but incomplete, you might say, in the battle without Joshua going out being the actuality of that. So of course it has to be acted out. But what I take it Dennis is asking us is, it's so easy to slip into a world in which, like, yeah, I know I should sacrifice, but well, I don't need to really follow these old rules, and it's a slow descent into not sacrificing at all. Mm-hmm. And so
that's the danger of abstraction.
That's what I think the text is saying. No, the firstborn, the circumcision, and you have, like, if you don't have these habits of recollection and reorientation, you can't leave it. Yeah, you forget.
Yeah. Well, and in terms of the relationship between acting out and abstraction, the text gets very serious about that now, because we're going to see that the law is revealed to Moses. But what we also see is Moses practices the law a very long time, concretely, without knowing its structure in any explicit sense. He practices it for God only knows how long before its structure is revealed to him. So even when the law is coming down from God on high, a prerequisite to that apparently is the pre-existent practice. So because this is what happens next, and it came to pass on the morrow that Moses sat to judge the people. And the people stood by Moses from the morning unto the evening. Now why? Well, now they're out in the desert, and there's no superordinate authority. And so what's happening? It's like the birth of English common law in some sense, is that the people get all fractious. They're murmuring not just against God, and they're doing that, but they're fighting with each other all the time. They have disputes, and they don't know what to do about the disputes, which is what makes them disputes. They don't know what the mediating principle is, or the higher order principle. And so, well, Moses is stuck with that. So they're all squawking away, following their whims and greed out in the desert, and they come into conflict, and Moses has to sit and judge. And
put it in terms of Nebo's bookends, they've escaped authoritarianism, but they have no structure, so they verge on anarchism.
Right. And we should point out very clearly that they're out of the tyranny, and they're in the deserts. Now they're free, but they're not free. They're just at each other's throats. And so this is the danger of the deterioration of an overarching system. Even if it's tyranny, it's like, well, yeah, at least we had the Pharaoh to tell us what to do and make sure we had enough to eat. And now we're out in the desert, and we're completely useless, and we're at each other's throats. And that's the freedom of no structure in the desert.
Disordered,
And we see this again and again in the wake of the big liberation movements. The French Revolution, of course, the Russian Revolution, in fact, even
English Revolution
too, even a revolution inspired by Exodus itself. There's a liberation.
That's what the king was for.
Exactly, which leads to just a kind of sort of anomia, complete lawlessness.
And that's the anarchy that the idiot anarchists are always trying to promote. It's like, well, if we just get rid of all structures of order, and the libertines do the same thing. It's just to be paradise on earth. It's like, no, it's just like a descent into this Hobbesian animalistic chaos. And then the way the Rousseauian types deal with that is they say, well, people are only evil because society made them so. It's like, that so shows you don't really know very much about people, and you better bloody well be sure you're not around in the aftermath of your revolution. So, because it's also often, it's so often
Lord of the Flies.
The case that, the Lord of the Flies, it's very often the case too that it's the people who are naive about the utopian structure of the post-revolution order that are the first sacrificial victims in the consequent desert.
Robespierre and the Girondins in 1793,
well,
1794.
And the old Reds in the Soviet Union, it's like they were gone real fast.
Let me give Os Guinness credit. Os Guinness's theory, which I 100% subscribe to, is the battle today is between the Sinai and the French Revolution. It's 100% correct.
That seems right.
And I'm happy to publicize you as the author of that notion.
So do you want to elaborate on that briefly?
No. Oh, you mean in terms of America?
Well, or
America was founded with this ordered freedom, and now everything's coming down from the French Revolution, postmodernism, identity, a whole lot.
Right.
Is a completely different view of revolution.
And it's a Luciferian view in many ways, I think.
This is a founding moment, and it's also a return to nature, right? Compare these conversations in this with the ones when Moses is talking to Pharaoh. God's not making anybody say anything. And he's got his thumb on the scale when Moses doesn't want to have the conversation, you got to have it. Pharaoh wants to agree, God hardens his heart. In other words, he's pushing an outcome. But this reads like, what if you've been gone for a long time doing a bunch of venturesome stuff and you see your father-in-law and you're back in the family? And now you got to figure out a way to govern yourself because God's not telling you every minute. And that's, so this
he's
is
not a tyrant either.
That's very explicitly not. In other words, he wishes our good, and that's why he made us like him in one respect. And so this is like a debate between the French Revolution and Sinai.
Yeah.
And they've got to figure out how to do it.
This is also a prodrome in some sense to the English common law tradition, because what happens here, this is so cool though, even though the law descends from on high, that's not exactly right, because the people are having conflicts and then Moses is aggregating the law by adjudicating. And one of the things you have to understand, obviously, is that if two people come to you in conflict and you merely tyrannize one of them, say, no, I don't have time for you, you get what you want and you don't, then there's no mediated conflict. That's just going to rekindle in no time flat. What you have to do is you have to go through the conflict with discriminating justice and mercy, and you have to reconcile the conflict in relationship to some transcendent third place that satisfies both parties. They have to see it. It has to be just and be seen to be just. And so that means that in some sense, Moses, sitting as the appropriate judge, is communing with the spirit of justice and mercy itself in order to render these judgments. And while he's doing that, the people are informing them about the full range of their psychological and social problems, right? And so he's aggregating what you might say a vision of what the law has to be in his own imagination. And so,
but Moses' first response is equally wrong. In other words, they've escaped the authoritarianism of Pharaoh, but when he counters the near anarchy, he's setting himself up as a one man.
Right. Well, and
that's bad too.
Right. Well, and it's bad for him too.
Bad for him, absolutely, and bad for the people.
Right.
And the covenantal system to come will be very different.
Right, and we see the emergence of that realization right in this part of the text as well.
So he's not Pharaoh, but there are incipient dangers in what he's doing.
Right. There's a temptation there and a danger.
I think it's important I think the analogy with the English common law is a very, very good one. But in the English common law, you have the development of a system of law based on concrete disagreements, contractual disputes. And what's going on when a judge is trying to, Blackstone is the great sort of father of English common law jurisprudence. what's going on there, as Blackstone says, is the discernment of the principles of natural justice.
Yes,
it's not as if the judges are just often we use the phrase judge-made law to distinguish from statute law. That's not what's going on. The thought
discovering.
It's judge-discovered law. And I think that's part of the significance of the figure of Jethro. He's, as it were, he's outside the people of Israel, but he still sacrifices not to Yahweh, but to Elohim in verse 12. So he's still got that, and as we'll see, he starts to give very sensible advice. But it's not, as it were, revealed reason. It's natural reason. It's the reason written on the law, written on the hearts of the Gentiles.
Well, you can tell that if you're having a dispute with your wife and the two of you commune in relationship to the dispute and you come up with a solution, the reason you regard it as a solution in some real sense is because it follows the laws of natural, I would say the optimal balance of justice and mercy, because you both say, oh, that will work. And not only will that work, but that satisfies me and it satisfies you, and then it satisfies both of us, or maybe we're really in a good situation and we think that's an even better solution than either of us wanted. It's not like that's arbitrary,
right?
Not at all.
And I think that's why this theme of creation, the giving of the creation of the natural order, and the creation of moral order that's about to emerge are seen as completely intertwined. Yeah. That is to say that creatures bear within them a kind of, at least in an embryonic form.
Yes, a nascent form.
A capacity to discern the principles of moral order.
Yeah, well, you certainly see that in animal behavior, and the sophisticated animal behaviorists who exist now have laid out very clearly, especially Frans de Waal, the nascent emergence of something like an iterative sense of reciprocal justice among, say, chimpanzees, other primates. Clearly, you can see it in rats, complex social animals. There's a sense of reciprocal justice, something like that. It's nascent, right? Because it's not representational, but it's nascent in Moses too. At this point, he doesn't know the law. He has to feel his way forward, but he is detecting a structure that's rising up from I think it's from the necessity of iterative interaction. It's something like that.
And in terms, when you said that, it just clicked for me, because I've been trying also to set up from the beginning St. Gregory of Nyssa's position, which is that the stranger in Exodus represents, let's say, in one aspect of what it represents is something like natural sciences, philosophy that isn't revealed from God, but that nonetheless can have some good if it's purified, if it's taken, well into it. And this just fits right in there, where, like you said, he's setting up a structure which is appropriate, which is good, but is not at all at the level of what will then be revealed by God. So, yeah, good stuff.
By the way, your comments on justice and mercy, my take on that is that they are often in conflict. Justice is you can't have both at the same time often. To put it in very concrete terms, justice is justice and mercy is social justice. That is the reason people use the term social justice. Why do they add an adjective to the term justice? Why does justice need an adjective? Because social justice has little to do with justice.
Well, that's partly why there's such an emphasis on inclusion to the exclusion of everything else. Everything has to be within.
Yes, but we will come to a law that proves it. You may not favor the poor in a courtroom. Right. Mercy favors the poor. Justice favors who is just.
Right. Well,
they are not the same, and it is truly, again, it is biblical versus modernity. Modernity favors mercy. The Bible favors justice.
I couldn't agree more, Dennis. And that's I think the adjective social is completely redundant, because I think justice is intrinsically social. There is no justice. A man on a desert island, there is no justice. He doesn't owe himself anything.
Right.
It's justice is something, a term that can only be applied in society, right? Between people.
So I would take some exception to the juxtaposition of justice and mercy. So I'd like to take that apart a little bit. So whatever God is, correct me if I'm wrong here, is represented in the Old Testament as the the principle to which both mercy and justice are subordinate. And so if mercy and justice are operating properly, they operate in relationship to a superordinate third principle. So if you're mediating conflict with someone, I've done a lot of this in my clinical work, mediating people through conflict. It's like you have to use justice to get mercy and vice versa. And that's partly because when you're walking through a conflict with someone, maybe you're working with a couple who's on the verge of divorce and you have to sort things out. It's like you're getting rid of a lot of stuff, and that's judging it. It's like it's separating the damned from the elect. It's separating the chaff from the wheat. And there's a judgmental quality about that, because it's like, no, don't do this thing anymore. It's like that's gone. But it isn't, the point of the judgment isn't the damning. The point of the judgment is the bringing forth of what's most valuable. And so that's the merciful part. It's like when you chide your children, it's not because you want to damn them. It's because you want to stop them doing something they're doing right now that's wrong, get rid of that, but so they can preserve and maintain that which is most precious about them, let's say, most valuable. And so you can't have justice without mercy, and you can't have mercy without justice. It's also partly because mercy just forgives everything. It's like, well, that's fine. If you're 100% perfect the way you are, then every bit of you can be accepted. But then what are you going to become? And so it looks to me like this intermingling of mercy and justice is the handmaiden of becoming out of being. It's something like that, because it brings what's best.
Right, but society has to be governed by justice first. Mercy, as I don't know if I said it here, but I've a dictum that we have to show mercy in the micro and justice in the macro.
Yeah. You know,
justice is the system and mercy is the relational.
Okay, so you can see this reflected at the level of personality, in temperament, biologically. There's two fundamental mediating principles that are instantiated in temperament that are social. So extroversion just means you like being around people. Forget about that one. Agreeableness, that's compassion, that's maternal care, that's mercy. And some people are by temperament more merciful. Women, for example, particularly in egalitarian societies. So it's a maternal virtue. And that makes sense because the primary orientation towards infants should be compassion. Because infants under 6 months are correct in everything they assume 100% of the time. And everything in some sense should be sacrificed to them. But it doesn't work. So here's an idea, is that compassion doesn't scale as you move up the hierarchy of complexity. So what happens is that you move from an ethos of agreeableness to an ethos of conscientiousness. And conscientiousness is judgment and rule following. And if you look at what predicts, and you could test this, you say, okay, if agreeableness is the fundamental ethos for large-scale social organizations, then more agreeable people should make better managers. And they don't. They make worse managers. What makes better managers is conscientious people. And it also tends to be the case that conscientious, disagreeable people make better managers, and those people tend more often to be conservative. So I think the data on this is already clear. There's no indication that the ethos of compassion scales. And so
I don't know if we really differ.
No, I don't think we do. I was just elaborating on your point.
By the way, on your point about the 6-month-old is always right, which I subscribe to. In a nutshell, part of our crisis is that a lot of people want to remain infants.
Yes, well, I think part of here's the world conceptualization view of compassion. It's reflexive. There are 3 categories of creature: infants, infant caretakers, and predators. And you're in one of those categories. And so if you don't differentiate your ethos beyond raw compassion, you regard yourself as an infant caregiver, let's say. You regard those who you're interacting with as infants if you're responsible for them, and everyone else is a predator. It's like, well, that's exactly what we have now. And it's the attempt to increase the dominion of that feminine ethos that's fundamentally predicated on compassion up the hierarchical structure. And there's no evidence whatsoever that will work.
Exactly.
So, and Yeah, well, that was Freud's point too.
Then,
So
what did you mean by justice is only macro? Because
No,
surely
there's justice in the micro, but in the micro, in my relation to my friends, my family, even my coworker,
What if you use the
I
word
can see-
personal, like the word personal?
Personal, that's just fine. Yes, personal would be perfect. That is what I mean by micro, yes. And I want to treat the person I interact with on a one-to-one basis primarily with mercy.
Mm-hmm.
I fully acknowledge
kindness.
that. Kindness,
Yeah, which
mercy,
means
all
kin.
these things. But the society must be governed by justice.
Well, it's possible also. Look, conscientiousness looks like a cold virtue. Like a conscientious
Right,
person
it looks cold, right?
It looks cold. Conscientious person, because you can have a conscientious, disagreeable person.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that your relationship with them is based on liking. It means that if they say they will do something, so they enter into a contractual arrangement, they will do it. And so then you might say, and why wouldn't it be the case, that as we move up in the complexity of society, so there's more and more people integrated, that you have to move towards more abstract systems of rules, which is exactly what's about to happen here, because the same principles don't operate within the confines of a family that can operate at a state. Like Ben Shapiro told me, he's a communist with his kids. It's like, well, why? Well, it's to each according to their need, from each according to their ability, which is, well, of course, that's what you do with little kids. And so, but that doesn't scale. There's no reason to assume that something that works at the micro will necessarily work at the macro. That lots of times that
That's
doesn't
why
happen.
we shouldn't choose leaders based on whether they're nice.
At the same time, I think we have to be careful not to overly anthropomorphize the divine attributes. I mean, it can be merciful to show justice, and it can be just to show mercy. And ultimately, these attributes in the divine life can't be in attention. There's one unity to the divine life, and we see this with the Passover, right? This, simultaneously in the same event, absolute justice and total mercy. And so, while I think these things are true in the micro and the macro, these are very important distinctions. I think if we're talking about the principle of all things, we have to de-anthropomorphize the question.
And when Moses is sitting, we'll start with 13 again, 18:13. And it came to pass on the morrow that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood by Moses from the morning until the evening. So this is just happening nonstop here. And when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he did to the people, he said, "What is this thing that thou doest to the people? Why sittest thou thyself alone?" That's to your point, Oz. Alone might not be the right way to do this. "And all the people stand by thee from morning until evening." And Moses said unto his father-in-law, being a conscientious person, "Because the people come unto me to inquire of God. When they have a matter," I love that word too, a matter. It's such a weird word, matter, because it means mother and it means matrix. And we're materialists, so we think things are made out of matter. But we also say, what's the matter? And that matters. And there's an implication there in that word that what's the matter is real, and that the fact that something matters is also real. And so we have an intimation within the word matter itself that there's an element of reality that's about what matters. And so when Moses says, when they have a matter, something's come between them that causes conflict, and it's real. That's why it's a matter. And out of that matter, you can extract out the principle of order.
You're right to emphasize that, by the way, from the Hebrew, because this modern translation that I unfortunately chose to use my commentary on, and I correct it very often, the Hebrew is thing. And they translate it as dispute. That's not correct. The Hebrew is the simple word, davar means thing. There's no question about it. So you're right. That's what it is.
Yeah, well, it's an open question whether what's more real is the matter or what's the matter. It's really an open question, and we don't know how to answer that, because in some sense we can abstract and we can say the objective matter is the most real. But that isn't how we act. We act as though what's the matter is the most real. We're most responsive to that. So, for example, we're very responsive to the cries of children, because that's about what's the matter. And then you think, well, is that an ontological proposition? And I would say that's a really good question, because it isn't obvious to me at all that matter in the reductionist sense is more real than pain. We don't act that way. In fact, we're not happy with people who reverse the order of priority. So, anyways. And Moses said unto his father-in-law, because the people come unto me to inquire of God. When they have a matter, they come unto me. And I judge between one and another. He uses scales, so you know which is the heavier thing, so that you can sequence them properly. And I do make them know the statutes of God and his laws. Well, there we know what's coming, because it's just laid out right in the text. I make them know the statutes of God and his laws. And so that's what the proper peacekeeper does, because Moses is definitely keeping peace here. And it's so interesting to me that de Waal, the Dutch primatologist, has shown that the alpha males, even in chimps, are the peacemakers, not the tyrants. That's so cool. And Moses' father-in-law said unto him, the thing that thou doest is not good. This wilt surely wear away, both thou and this people that is with thee. Yeah, so you're right, Oz, to emphasize that point. It's like it's dangerous to Moses because it's too much. And it's dangerous to the people because all the authority is vested in one man.
Yeah, Pharaoh.
Perfect, yeah. So he's being tempted by the necessity for authority is calling the potential Pharaoh out in him. And Jethro is the one who says that's a bad idea. Yeah, so that's so interesting. Thou art, for this thing is too heavy for thee, too material for thee. Thou art not able to perform it thyself alone. Hearken now unto my voice. I will give thee counsel, and God shall be with thee. Be thou for the people to Godward, that thou mayest bring the causes unto God. So he's telling Moses to remember that he's acting as judge, but fundamentally the judge here is God. And then Jethro's also pointing out that if Moses had any sense, he'd be distributing the responsibility. And so that's cool too, because Moses is a prophet of God and guided by God, but even so, it's not up to him to do everything. He should be distributing the responsibility in as much as possible, because everyone else needs something important to do. And because if he takes all the responsibility unto himself and all the glory, then it's Pharaoh time again in the desert. So,
and this is such a key verse, right? Because it has the very nature of mediation is always going in both directions, right? It has to come from the above to the below, and it goes from the below right to the top.
Yeah, that's part of the negotiated discussion that seems to be going on between the people and Moses. The people and Aaron and Moses and God, back and forth continually. So it's a dialectical process, and not a static condition.
Which prefigures the more structured mediation that we're going to see in the next few chapters.
It struck me, I think you were with me the day that I went to the UK Parliament when I was in the UK, but I was in the lobby, which is where people lobby the government. So that was quite cool. And it's a chamber between the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and you can come there to call on your representative. And so really I had this vision of the voice of the people coming into the lobby and then being represented by those who make the body of laws. And so that is the encounter with the people. And the Brits have done an unbelievably remarkable job of managing that, I think, better than anyone ever has in history. I think you could make that case and set the pattern for the US and the whole Commonwealth and for the world at large, but by formalizing the rise of the voice of the inchoate voice of the people through their representatives into the body of law. And there's a sovereign on top of that, obviously the Queen, but if that dialectic between the people and the Queen isn't working, then the system isn't hierarchically organized properly.
It's worth pointing out, and this is a famous point made by Edmund Burke in a speech to the electors at Bristol, that what the people are doing, it's not as if there's a kind of direct mediation of the voice of the people through their representatives. The people select their representatives on the basis of their judgment. And that judgment may, during the course of their elected office, be exercised in a way that might cut against what the direct will of the people might be in that particular situation. But so what's being mediated, as it were, is the sort of is the collective sort of judgment, the sort of orientation towards justice in the people, incipient in the people, as opposed to
and they're
what you might
elected,
have.
which means so the people aggregate together and agree. We will allow this person to be put up above us to represent us, right? So that, and that also helps protect the society. This is extraordinarily important and might be relevant to the breakdown of social media structures. It's like, well, now everybody has a voice all the time. It's like, yeah, great. Now we've got this clamoring rabble in the desert. It's just a bloody catastrophe, and the narcissists are everywhere, and so are the psychopaths and the Machiavellians. There's no hierarchical mediation.
Right. It's a principle that controls the cacophony that would break out if you had a direct democracy, as you would, as
which
you
would
had,
be
say, in fifth
democracy
century
by
Athens.
whim.
Yes, effectively, it would become kind of it's a sort of incentivizes demagoguery, as Athens Thucydides describes so brilliantly in the figure, the thuggish demagogue Cleon, in his History of the Peloponnesian War, and it's one of the reasons the Athenian democracy, though it is often thought of as the cradle of democracy, disintegrates so quickly.
It's also partly why the left-wingers are worried about populism on the right. It's because, well, they don't want to see, to give the devil his due, they don't want to see rule by whim. And neither should conservatives who are intelligent, because we should have enough sense, let's say, or they should have enough sense to understand the necessity of these mediating structures and not to pull them down with casual complaints that they've become too corrupt to be sustainable.
Yeah. Although normally I think what they mean by populism is kind of code for the expression of the will of the people that cuts against their own.
Right, but that's why I said you have to give the devil his due. There is this, because people like to think, well, we should just have direct democracy, and isn't it wonderful that we have a public marketplace where everybody can shout at the same time, which is really what social media platforms are. It's like, yeah, no, that's not so wonderful. It looks like it's a very dangerous form of insanity. And so,
one of the things I just want to notice, one last thing about the notion of mediating structure, is that in the text, one of the things that are a little funny is that Moses is talking to God. He's getting it from God, but it's as if now every single person wants their individual law, right, based on their little problem. And those problems are indefinite. So there's an indefinite possibility of issue or thing that pops up, and now they want to get their little law. So instead of, there's a million possible laws. And so the mediating structures are also there to aggregate possibilities so that you don't need that. So
you don't need a million laws.
Right, so you can think about like a family in a house where every time the children eat, they go to their mom and they ask, oh, Mom, what do I do with the glass? Oh, Mom, what do I do with this? And it's driving her crazy. And so we set up systems, which is like, no, this is, when you're done with your dinner, this is where everything goes. And you make your bed, you do this. And it makes the laws aggregate the issues that could happen in the house so that we're not having someone always asking their boss what to do. I mean, everybody's had that experience if they're in a team where things aren't clear enough so that now everybody's wondering every single time what they need to do.
Well, that's exactly what's happening on the identity front right now, is that we've decided that everyone can be the categorical avatar of their own identity, independent of everyone else. It's like, oh, I see. So every single identity that's out there is now going to be paramount. That's
what it leads to is that every single human being in the end will have their own gender.
Right.
So there's actually as many genders as there are individuals ultimately.
Yeah.
But that doesn't work, right? So you need systems of cohesion, or else.
Well, or you don't have cohesion.
That's right.
And then when you don't have cohesion, you don't have. It isn't freedom that you have without cohesion. It's absolute bloody catastrophe. Yes. Okay. So. Be thou for the people to Godward, help lead them upward, that thou mayest bring the causes unto God. And so Moses is also mediating between the people and God, which is what a good representative should be. And thou shalt teach them ordinances by which they arrange themselves, and laws, and shalt show them the way wherein they must walk. And that metaphor is used because a law, see, if you mediate a principle between you and your wife, it isn't just that it satisfies the dispute, it's that it makes the dispute unnecessary moving forward. And so now you have a way to walk with her again in accordance with this principle where there's no conflict. You can both walk together. So the natural justice principle not only has to satisfy the emotion that's generated by the conflict, but it has to show a clear mediating path forward that's reciprocal and maintainable. And so, and our sense of that is an orientation sense. Our sense of that is what enables us to decide that a solution is a good solution.
As we come to the next verse, about the 4 characteristics of a leader, please note what's missing.
And the work that they must do. Okay, so now you have the principles, and that tells you how to walk forward, so it's active, but also what you should sacrifice to, because you sacrifice the lower to the higher constantly, and the work that they must do. Moreover, thou shalt provide out of all the people, this is so cool, able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, so they're not selfish, and place over such them to be rulers of thousands and rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s,
so we
and
have
rulers of 10s.
Capable, God-fearing, men of truth, hating corruption. It's really corruption, not covetousness. Doesn't matter. Same thing. What's missing in the type of person who should become a leader? What I was talking about. Doesn't say a word about compassionate men.
So I thought this, when the Americans were going to bring democracy during the Gulf Wars, it's like, well, you get rid of the tyrant, now you have a desert. Well, so what do? Well, they dissolved all the intermediating structures. It's like, well, that isn't going to work because you need intermediating structures. You move into a country and you get rid of the tyrants. Now what do you have to do? Well, you need rulers of thousands broken down into rulers of hundreds, broken down into rulers of 50s and rulers of 10. So an entire hierarchical apparatus. And so one of the things that people...
It's military, really. The way we understand the military is exactly that way.
Yeah, well, Hernando de Soto pointed out when he was analyzing attempts to economically transform cultures who didn't have, say, a capitalist system based on the notion of rights, that you just couldn't import that and put it on top of a desert. The intermediary structures, and we don't even know what they are because they're invisible to us in our own society, the intermediating structures had to be built. And so this is so brilliant here. You have the people calling for judgment. Moses provides it. Jethro warns them, don't become the Pharaoh. How do you do that? Well, a little humility on your part would be good, but distribute the responsibility, and it has to be distributed hierarchically all the way down, in some sense, to the unit of the individual. So you have 10 people together. They say, well, this guy's good enough. Then you get the 5 of the 10 together and you elect him, and you build a hierarchy all the way up to God. That's essentially what's happening here. It's so smart. And let them judge the people at all seasons. And this is an echo of the whole English common law court system. There's local courts, and then there's courts of courts, and courts of courts of courts, all the way up to the top. And if you try to mediate the principle at the most local possible level, which would be, say, between you and your wife. You can't manage that. You get divorced. You go to the next highest authority. And then if that causes conflict, there's another authority above that.
All the way up to the Crown Court in criminal proceedings. So that the Crown, as it were, is the source of sovereignty and the source of ultimate judicial power and sovereignty. But as you say, there's a kind of waterfall of justice all the way down to the local level.
Right.
And there is the principle of subsidiarity, which has developed a great deal in the Catholic social justice tradition, which means that there's got to be a proper allocation, a proportionate application of justice at the right level. Right. So there will be some
and
cases.
the rule of thumb is that the best level is the lowest level possible.
If in doubt, that's right. Justice should be meted out at the closest, at the most local level.
Right.
Unless
This is so crucial because part of what's happening with the EU shaking is that this principle of subsidiarity is being violated, is that too much power, and Larry, you were talking about that last night too, is that there is a proclivity for the thing in the highest place to become everything. And that's happening by your estimation with the federal government system in the US, where it's just eating up more and more and more and more and more and more of the resource and responsibility pie. And then the necessary and inevitable consequence of that isn't utopia. It's pharaonic tyranny. Or the desert.
It's the Israelites, when they get out of Egypt, they have to go through a lot of hard things because they've been slaves for a long time. They don't know how to do anything. And now what they have to learn is they're going to have to learn to govern themselves. And that means self-restraint. And see, if you take that away, that's what Pharaoh has taken from them. He's taken from them the ability to lead a human life. And if that's why my opinion is, it's hard to get kids to learn in school today because it's all told how they're supposed to do it and even what they're supposed to learn. And that, and they everybody wants to learn. I mean, why is anybody watching this? And why do we know what we know when we say here? We want to know. You should rely on that, right? And that's so the lowest level possible, that means everybody is practicing getting along.
Yeah, and practicing responsibility. And you don't want to deprive people of that responsibility. You don't want to treat students like they're empty vessels to have material poured into them, right? That's the social engineering error. So you're calling forth something out of the students rather than filling out something that's empty.
But again, Jordan, not to be contrarian, we can praise what they're doing here, but surely the whole point of this before 19 and 20, this is good as far as it goes. But what they're going to have in the covenant is so much richer. As I remember one rabbi said, this is a matter of justice, administrative, judges, and so on. What they're going to get in the covenant is how they can become just people,
right,
and have just relationships.
So that's part of the revelatory quality.
We got to compare this and contrast it with the far greater thing that's coming.
Well, you could say it up to this point, even to some degree, this is analogous of the organization of an animal social society. So, in a complex animal social society like the chimp societies, say, there is hierarchical organization, but there's no superordinate principle that's revealed. It's not like the chimps know what principle they're governing themselves by when they govern themselves properly. Like with wolves, for example, when wolves strive for dominance, for authority, let's say, that's probably a better way of thinking about it. One wolf will threaten the other, and they get right to it. They'll get right to the point of fighting. Sometimes they even fight, but generally they don't. And you might say, well, why not? Why doesn't one wolf just destroy another? And the answer to that is something like, well, who's going to bring down the moose? Like, you need the wolf along with you. And so the way the wolves have learned to deal with that, or are biologically prepared to deal with it, is that they'll bristle at each other, and then one capitulates, and when he capitulates, he rolls over and shows his neck, and that means the other wolf could kill him. And then that wolf is now subordinate, and maybe rightly so in a functional wolf society. So the animals do organize themselves into these hierarchical structures, but they have no second order consciousness of the structures or principles or spirit that constitutes that proper ordering. And it's the case, and it's presented this way because when Moses has the law revealed to him, it's a blinding revelation, right? So it's an event of cosmic significance. It's something like the dawn of self-consciousness in the Garden of Eden, and so that snapping into accordance of the propositional and imaginal on top of the procedural is presented here as a revolution in human cognitive function.
Can I
rightly so.
Can I ask if people have any thoughts about these? Dennis was remarking the four attributes. Some seem in a way obvious. I mean, able men who fear God, men of truth. But this hating covetousness, I'm really wondering why is that so fundamental? Not to be covetous, but to hate covetousness. And it's something like. It's the obliteration, that the condition of this whole system is the obliteration of envy and resentment.
Well, and you can't be a judge if you're envious, not a just judge, because then it'd be all about you.
Right, and the current ideological claim, of course, is that everything's about power, right? And the claim here is something like this mediation that Jonathan's talking about can only take place if the individuals who are mediating totally like the individual realization can only take place when the individuals mediating it totally subordinate themselves to that good, without any regard.
And it's the opposite. Yes. I think it is the opposite of envious resentment.
Right. It's actually the renunciation of a kind of will to power in a profound way.
Yeah. And there's something very interesting going on in terms of kind of counterpoint, moving from the Hebraic to the Hellenic. In Plato's Republic, it's striking that the philosopher rulers are expected to live a very ascetic life, no family, they don't get married. They're supposed to kind of cultivate in their lives and their behavior a kind of humility, a kind of
self-sacrifice.
Self-dispossession. That's a very, very important criterion for the philosopher rulers.
And you see, well, with the elevation or the election, let's say, of elders in traditional societies, is the elders are marked by their productivity, but also their generosity. And that would be some combination of agreeableness and conscientiousness. So their love for their own family, but also their willingness to abide by the general social rules and to be generous in their provision. And so that's what makes them moral authority. So this idea that these hierarchies, it's an unbelievably corrosive idea. The idea that human hierarchies always were and must be and always will be fundamentally predicated on power. And you're just naive if you don't believe that. You're naive if you don't think they can be corrupted by power. Yes. But you're cynical and bitter beyond redemption if you abide by the notion that power is the ultimate authority.
Part of the genius of the Emperor Augustus when he gets power after the end of the Civil War in 31 BC is that he presents himself as living a very kind of monastic life. He lives in a little hut on the top of the Palatine Hill, and he's saying he launches like a big back to basics campaign, stress on the family, simplicity.
He renounces all his titles.
That's right, renounces all his titles as he's acquiring more and more power and founding one of the greatest sort of imperial dynasties the world's ever known.
It's funny. Now I'm going to make the point I debated whether to make because I don't like to differ with Plato. Who am I? But if the only thing I knew about a person was that he was an ascetic, I would not vote for him.
All right, and let them judge the people at all seasons. And let them judge the people at all seasons. Differentiated judgment, very so cool. And it shall be that every great matter they shall bring unto thee, but every small matter they shall judge. So shall it be easier for thyself, and they shall bear the burden with thee. Great management strategy, that differentiation, distribution of responsibility, and the facilitation of local autonomy. It's such a great principle. If thou shalt do this thing, and God command thee so, then thou shalt be able to endure, and all this people shall also go to their place in peace. And so Jethro is definitely a stand-in for God here. So Moses hearkened to the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he said. And Moses chose able men out of all Israel, so functional and productive, and made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands, hundreds, 50s, and 10s. And they judged the people at all seasons. The hard causes they brought unto Moses, but every small matter they judged themselves. And Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went his way into his own land. All right.
Father-in-law does a lot in that chapter.
Yeah, he does. He's just
Comes in for a few
what
weeks,
you need there.
sorts things out, and all right, I'm heading home.
Yeah. Exodus 19. In the third month, this is first verse. In the third month, when the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day came they into the wilderness of Sinai. For they were departed from Rephidim and were come to the desert of Sinai and had pitched in the wilderness. And there Israel camped before the mount. Okay, so now they're near a mountain, and that's dead relevant here. And Moses went up unto God, which is where you go, by the way, because up is transcendent and up is towards the heavens, and up is toward the sun, and up is where the head is, and up is where the eye is, and so up is allied for us with elevation, and elevation is allied for us with the notion of moving towards something better.
Also solitude, I think, the solitude of, as it were, the sort of sovereignty of God and the solitude of the person who is confronted by God at the top of the mountain. Yeah.
The solitude, maybe that's part of that necessity to meditate, right? To be away from the crowd, especially if you're a prophet figure, right?
Yeah, but you could also understand it as the mountain itself, as it moves from the many into the one. So you have, yourself, like
that's a pyramid.
A person must move into oneness, or else they're schizophrenic, or else they
or chaotic.
Yeah.
And anxious. Yeah. So this is something very much worth delving into, because we could debate about the utility of monotheism. It's like, okay, What do you mean? Why are we debating that? Is there no fundamentally uniting principle? Is that your argument? And is it not an animating principle, which you have to act out? So is it not a spirit in some real sense? And maybe the most real sense is like, we don't need something at the top of the hierarchy. Okay, fine. Then what? Then there's no direction. Well, what if there's no direction? Well, then there's no hope. Well, what if there's directionless absence of hope? Then you have chaos and anxiety and frustration and terror and bitterness and disunity. And so that means the cost of not putting something in the highest place is all that. And so...
But again, Jordan, with due respect, you're saying with monotheism, do we need that? Whereas surely the whole point of Exodus is that all the other options, paganism, etc., numerous options, monotheism was not because anyone constructed it or needed it or invented it. Moses met it. And you got to start there. It's an encounter from which...
Well, I'm not only making an argument in terms of practical necessity, because I do think that why would we not assume that the principle that unifies everything in the highest manner isn't the most real thing, right? It's like a definition of real. Mm-hmm. I'm just also pointing out that if you make the counter argument, because people think, well, you don't need this tyrannical monotheistic principle. It's like, okay, fine. Speaking purely secularly, fine. Now we don't have an organizing principle. What do we have? Well, we have social disunity because nothing unites us. And so then definitely we have conflict. So that's the sociological outcome. And psychologically, well, we don't have hope because you have hope in relationship to an orienting goal. And we have anxiety because anxiety signals the excess multiplicity of choices, which is what you have when things haven't been reduced to a unity. So purely on secular grounds, you
all
need
the alternatives have their uniting principles. So the Enlightenment, Diderot says, in one word, the Enlightenment is reason. Mm-hmm. You know, postmodernism, you said, Stephen, one word, the postmodernism is power.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
They all have their united and they work out badly.
Right. Yeah, well, it's so interesting with the postmodernists because they say, there's no grand uniting narratives. And they say, accept power. Oh, yeah, there's the Marxists. Accept power. Remember power? It's like, we remember it all right.
But I think it's worth adding, you said earlier, Jordan, you talked about the sort of pure secular reason. But I think there is within monotheism the sense that reason is also gifted by God, that we have reason naturally. Surely that's the point, the message of the previous chapter, that Jethro has reason, and that we can use reason to think about the nature of ultimate reality. And Western philosophy, in many ways, is a story about a battle between whether or not ultimate reality is plural and many, atomistic, as often Hobbesian materialism or corpuscularianism, as they sometimes call it, the Heraclitus view that nature is like fire; it's completely plural. On the one hand, and on the other hand, that ultimate reality is unified, is a single being, as it were, as Parmenides puts it. And monotheism understands that. It sets it out very, very powerfully.
Abides by it.
Yes, and it's revealed both through direct revelation, as we're about to see, but it can also be arrived at through reason, through reason and inference.
That's the fundamental Western proposition in some real sense. I would say that's the meaning of Greece and Jerusalem in the most real sense, right? Is that the logos that's divinely revealed and the logos that emerges as a consequence of ethical, rational apprehension turn out to be the same thing.
You might say that, what you were saying earlier is that there's something significant and even perhaps theologically suggestive or resonant from this passage in psychological unity. You might say, maybe this is a little bit speculative, but if we are made in the image of God, then what it is to be made in the image of God is at the very least to be a person who is psychologically unified.
But there is a limit. I mean, I think I see in Oz that he's saying, wow, there's a limit. And I think that limit is there in the text, and it's there in the manner in which Christians have understood it from the beginning. If I take again our St. Gregory of Nyssa, he talks about reason the whole time. He talks about reason until the point where Moses enters into the divine darkness. And that moment of revelation is one which necessarily is beyond all possible definition and beyond any reason. It is something which comes to him from absolute.
Well, I think reason has to be put in the properly subordinate place. And so one of the things I was struck by in both Mesopotamian and Egyptian theology was their emphasis not on reason, but on attention. And attention is superordinate to reason, because attention provides it allows for the incoming of what reason can then contend with. And
it's like a little revelation. It's given
to you. It's a revelation.
It's something that you
attention
cannot...
is openness to revelation.
You can't work towards.
In fact, you could define it that way. Yeah. Attention is literally openness to revelation.
Yeah, though I do think there's something of a difference between East and West in this point. I mean, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word, the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I mean, that's a totalizing statement. Now, one can have deep conversations about.
But would you say that the Trinity is reasonable?
Well, I think one has to think long and hard about what logos means, right? And what sense in which
in the language in which he was talking, it means reason.
Well, I would not want to equate this with kind of narrow enlightenment, reductive, instrumental rationality at all, but whether the first principle is known by itself and in its self-giving returns to itself as known. I think that I would only want to say that in the narrow sense of reason, yes, of course that's transcendent, but in a higher sense.
Part of the logos isn't, it's reason also as a process, right? Because dialogue is it's not a description of a state, it's a process of engagement that reveals the truth. And so the logos isn't reason in the algorithmic sense. It's
not at all.
much broader
it's the ordering principle of all reality. And I think that...
But we say in the Creed, we say God created through the Son. That is, the logos is the means by which the world appears, but the Father is not the logos. The Father is not reason. God is beyond all reason.
Absolutely right. Yeah. And God is beyond at least our rational capacities.
Yeah, well, if God isn't beyond reason, doesn't reason become Luciferian?
That's what I think. I think the reason why Christ is not Lucifer is because he is the divine logos who receives everything from his Father. Mm-hmm. He is not self-defined.
Yeah. But the Western view also is that the wholeness of the Father is comprehended by the Son as he turns back to the Father, right? So there's no remainder that isn't given and comprehended. And so
if the door is open to that occurring, but it also still means that principle has to be subordinate to the Father.
But Jordan, my heart jumped when you invited me for Exodus. Because, Matthew Arnold's idea, the West is this conversation between what he called the Hebrew and the Hellene.
Mm-hmm, right.
And there's no question, your field and many others, the Greeks have had the bigger say. Mm-hmm. And I think it's time to restore the balance. And that's why my heart jumped.
That's why I think it's so...
Because when it comes to freedom, the biblical, the Hebrew, is infinitely richer.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's why I think, too, that it's necessary to point out that the Logos tradition on the Hellenic side is the tradition that Logos is an animating spirit, right? It's something that can be embodied. It's something that isn't necessarily incarnated in its fundamental essence because it has to be acted out. So it's not what happens in the Enlightenment is you get a hyperstress of something like the disembodied rational and abstract. And it's like, fair enough, that's a powerful entity, but don't forget about, this is also why there's such Christian emphasis on the resurrection of the body, the idea of the value of the body, is that you don't want to float off into the worship of the purely abstract. And so...
But I think Oz is trying to... I think you should finish your point, because I think you're trying to make a point rather about this experience of God as this revelation from beyond that Moses experienced as a unique moment. I think you should finish your point.
Well, no, as monotheism comes from the initiative of God.
Yeah, that's
not because we've needed to invent it and the other systems didn't work. This one's better. No. I am who I am. I will be who I will be, etc. It all comes from that encounter with God. And that's why I admire, my background is sociology. You can use psychology or sociology. It interprets, explains a huge amount. But at the end of the day, God says. That's how we come to faith. Short of that,
You'd think of that as that manifestation of something like a pre-existent implicit pattern. That's the revelation.
It's even more than that. In the sense of God, we're dealing with the notion that it is even beyond pattern. What we're talking about is the infinite source of all things, as revealed Himself to Moses, and that first comes from above. Just in the same way that in creation, the movement starts with God, and we say as Christians, we believe also that grace comes first, right? It's like no matter what you do, without the grace of God, you won't do anything. So it has to flow down from above. And I think Oz, like in defense of Jordan, I think that because I've been working with Jordan for a very long time, and I understand what he's doing. He's in some ways trying to help people. He's talking to secularists who, when you say something like God says, their eyes glaze over and they cease to listen. They don't know what that means anymore. They think that God is just some arbitrary super being that is out there somewhere.
God of the gaps.
And that God is like just a guy who's equal to us, but he just happens to be God. And now he says things and we're supposed to listen. That's really what many atheist secularists think. But I think to be able to link this to the fact that it reveals a structure of reality that we encounter at every level, whether it is psychology, whether it is science, whether it is sociology, that although we should say exactly what you said, which is that God says, and that is what lays everything out, just like in Genesis, that we're at a point where people don't even know what that means. So we have to be able to build it in their perception from the bottom up, and to say, well, if you think that this works this way, you can't have it without the exact same story that we're being told in Exodus, and to lead people slowly, dimly, kind of grasping toward a moment where they'll say something like, we can't do any of. I know what this is talking about.
That.
If we're talking, I talk a lot on campuses. And I never begin that way. I actually begin very close to Genesis. It's the argument from the necessity of the alternative.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But again,
so
I think
analogous.
Again, we shouldn't think of this as a zero-sum game. That as if that there's an eruption from without, that God just sort of discloses Himself, reveals Himself, and then Moses sort of stands there, receives it, and then hands it down. The whole message of Genesis and Exodus is that there is the created natural order and the created moral order. And as the sort of medieval scholastics used to say, there's the book of Scripture, but there's also the book of nature. That is to say that there are principles of natural reason which absolutely can't attain perfection, can't attain sort of full understanding and comprehension of the divine, and can't understand grasp the specific content of God's revelation. But as it were, there's natural reason can prepare the way.
Mm-hmm. Also because God created natural reason.
Exactly.
It's actually the way in which God made us.
Yeah.
So it's not like we're completely blind and stupid until.
So don't you? I mean, when you're starting with young people, don't you start with something that's obvious to them that it's true, and then work from there? So like, there's a lot of things we know. We know that we're more capable, better than dogs, right? Although some dogs are better than some people, and we know that, right? And so what's higher about us? And then imagine that perfected. I think that's C.S. Lewis's argument for God that he makes over and over, and it's also all over Thomas Aquinas. And that means that there seems to be an order of the beings, and it seems to go up.
Otherwise, what would we strive towards?
That's my strategy exactly.
Well, they don't even accept any longer. It is quite popular on the left that we're not superior to animals.
Yeah, it's because they're. But the
They don't
thing
believe
is,
that.
Dennis,
Nobody
is
really believes
they
that.
don't stop striving.
I think they do. The anti-humanist element of the climate change movement, and I don't deny climate change, just for the record, but the hysteria leading to the belief that human beings are a blight on nature, animals are not, is very deep at this time.
You know, the movie, The Matrix, you guys watch movies? That's a turning point when Agent Smith is interrogating Morpheus under torture. And he moves the sweat off his forehead and tastes it and smells it. You're a virus. I figured out what the human beings are. They're cancer on the earth, right? And that's...
Oh, you see the same thing in the Marvel series where there's a Thanos, who's Thanatos, fundamentally. Thanos. He wipes out half of everything for the good of being. So, yes, this is a very deep problem.
On the great issues of our time, I am certain that it's not a matter of faith. I am logically, rationally certain that in America at least, and probably in the West generally, as a generalization with acknowledged exceptions, religious people are far more rational than the radically secular. And as one of the reasons, by the way, that I have come to believe in God is because I realize that my love of reason, why I call my commentary the Rational Bible, is because I use reason. My love of reason is dependent upon there being a God.
Well, Jung, one of the things that really struck me about Jung, and it was a surprise to me when I encountered it, was his insistence in some sense that Catholicism, he just used that as an example, he said, that's as sane as people get. Everything other than that is way worse. And so, despite its peculiarities and eccentricities and medieval madness and all
Voltaire,
of that.
the great atheist, said, I'm an atheist, but frankly, I hope my wife, my butler, my driver, and everyone I work with believes in God.
Yeah, very funny, very funny. All right. In the 3rd month, when the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day came they into the wilderness of Sinai, for they departed from Rephidim and were come to the desert of Sinai, and had pitched in the wilderness. And there Israel camped before the mount. And Moses went up unto God, and the Lord called him out of the mountain, saying, Thus shalt thou say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, You've seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings, way above everything where he could see, and brought you unto myself. Now, therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed, and keep all my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people.
An argument against unconditional love, which I know it's one of the least popular positions I take. I don't see a biblical basis for unconditional love, at least not in the Old Testament. And here is a perfect example. If you will follow me, you shall be my treasured possession.
Right. Well, that's a call to becoming that. And that's the problem with unconditional love. It's like it's so demoralizing, especially for young men. Like,
Thank you.
Well, you're
Thank
all right
you.
the way you are. It's
Yes.
like, you're 18 and you're miserable. It's like, well, you're lovely just the way you are. It's
No
like,
matter
well, they
how
don't
you
think
act.
that. No, it's a terrible thing. It's a devouring force, that unconditional, that blind unconditional acceptance. And then people use it also to elevate themselves morally falsely. Look at how much love I have. It's like, yeah, but you have no standards. So it's not so clear that what you have is love. It's like it's the devouring mother come back in full force. And that's a mythological trope of no little significance.
God bless you.
That's Freud too, in the Oedipal that's Freud. He's a great diagnostician.
He is.
He said the fundamental danger to the abiding spirit of mankind was the devouring element of blind compassion. That's a hell of a thing to say.
One of the many reasons he's not popular.
Yeah, that's for sure. And ye shall be unto me, assuming they keep the word, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. And Moses came and called for the elders of the people and laid before their faces all these words which the Lord commanded him. That's very interesting too. He doesn't go out and address all the people. He addresses the elders, and so he's moving down the revelation in a hierarchically structured manner. And all the people answered together and said, All that the Lord hath spoken we will do. And Moses returned the words of the people unto the Lord. Mediating figure again. And the Lord...
Those words come 3 times, and that's literally the origin of the consent of the governed. All that the Lord says, we will do, and that's repeated 3 times. And that came up in the 17th century strongly based on this.
Based on that. So all of that came out of this.
The consent of the governed.
Right. And the Lord said unto Moses, Lo, I come unto thee in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with thee, and believe thee forever. And Moses told the words of the people unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go unto the people, and sanctify them today and tomorrow. Get them ready. Get them in the proper receptive state, and let them wash their clothes. That's symbolic too. Clean themselves up, right? And be ready against the third day, for the third day the Lord will come down in the sight of all the people upon Mount Sinai. And thou shalt set bounds unto the people round about, saying, Take heed to yourself, that ye not go up into the mount, or touch the border of it. Whosoever toucheth the mount shall surely be put to death. You ask, well, why is God so dangerous? And I think you just have to think about that for a while before you can figure that out. It's like, touch sacred things at your great peril.
I want to mention just one little thing, which I think, for me at least, is beautiful in this text, which is that we were talking about this mediating structure. I'm talking about this hierarchy and how it lays itself out it's going to lay itself out in the law and the way everything is structured, in the structure of the tabernacle and all these things. But what God is saying is that, let's say, take the structure of the tabernacle as this hierarchical structure of revelation of God into the world. That's what you're going to be for the entire world. Mm-hmm. So what you're going to have within Israel, the priests, and the people coming to bring sacrifice and everything, you as a people are going to be the very thing. So it's a fractal structure all the way through. You're going to be that for the world. For all the world is mine.
Somewhere.
Because God doesn't say, He's saying it right here, right at the beginning of the covenant. He says, it's not just Israel that's mine. He says, the whole world is mine. But this is how I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it in a way that will lay itself out through mediations, and Israel will play that role for the entire world.
So now it's been...
Israel's the sacrificial firstborn of the nations.
Or at least it's for that as a nation. It's a nation of priests.
I think that was the plan. I mean, you guys probably covered all this better than I can, but I'll just say, isn't this a cosmic drama? Yeah. This whole book, right? This is God revealing Himself. Sometimes He takes over both ends of the conversation in a conflict to maneuver things into a tremendous display, right? And then the rest of the Bible, that's rehearsing. When the Jews remember who they are, they always rehearse these facts. I did these things so you can see who I am. And that's it.
And it still didn't work.
Well, but it's not over yet.
And also, he says all the way along, it won't.
Yeah, well, it's a real struggle, right? It's a real struggle. Yeah.
Struggle and maybe it's with God, that's what Israel means.
It's not even a foregone conclusion,
That's right.
What did you say? That's what Israel means, what?
Struggle with God.
Yeah, we who struggle with God, we who wrestle with God. That's so interesting too, because it means that the state that's the savior, in some sense, is composed of those people who are wrestling with the weightiest moral issues. And it's the wrestling that's actually the process, that's where the divinity resides, is in the wrestling. That's so interesting that it's in the process. That's why the logos and dialogue is so important, because that's all part of that process of wrestling with God.
If America had to be renamed by the founders, I'm just thinking now, it should have been renamed in the light of struggle with God Israel, struggle with the state. That's what America was founded to be, a struggle with the state. Secularists are much more accommodating to the state than religious people are to God. We question more than they do.
Well, so then you wonder, when you decimate the highest principle, you still need a highest principle. It's going to come somewhere.
That's right.
And that's what happens, is the state comes to substitute for God.
That's what it is.
Yeah, it's the Pharaoh. Yes, definitely.
That's right.
Yeah.
Bring me back to Egypt.
So don't be saying that you don't have a highest ordering principle. It's so interesting that the secularist types turn so rapidly. You see this with the humanists. It's like, oh, now your God's the state. You say you don't have God. It's like, yes, you do.
Yeah, we were
just
talking
the Pharaoh.
We were talking this morning, Jordan, about the cult of reason that was set up in Notre Dame in the wake of the French Revolution, an actual cult with all kind of religious symbolism and kind of liturgies and a kind of focal point. And it's just an extraordinary image that atheism produced is almost immediately a kind of...
what was it? Temple of Atheism? Was that what did he called it?
A culte de la raison.
And that was set up in the Notre Dame Cathedral of all places.
Temple of Reason,
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Chesterton who said that the definition of the madman is not the person who's lost his reason, but who's lost everything except his reason.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Did Chesterton say anything stupid?
No.
In private, maybe.
Every time, what?
Just as a joke.
In private, maybe.
Oh, in private. That's fine, though. That counts. He got it out in private. Chester, I mean, apropos of this, it's attributed to Chesterton. I couldn't verify that he said it, but why not? When people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing. They believe in anything.
Yes.
It's been very hard to actually locate that
I
quotation.
know, that's why I said
but
yes.
he ought to have said it.
That's right. No, if
It was
anybody
implicit
did,
in what he said.
it was him.
And
Right.
a lot of what he does say could be distilled into that.
Correct.
remark.
Right.
Yeah, well,
That's
the
how
thing
you
is
Winston Churchill quotes. Too.
Yeah, right.
It's the same thing.
Oh, yeah? Yogi Berra, too?
you can't move forward into the unknown without faith. You can't organize a community without faith. You can't organize yourself without faith. And so if you have no faith, you're disorganized. And so if you do organize yourself, then you have faith in something. And if it's not God, then you have to ask, okay, then, no. What is it?
Right.
What is it? And that's the blindness of the atheist. It's like,
They
well,
say
now your
so
God's
their
implicit.
answer is science.
Yeah.
That's what they
Yeah,
answer.
well,
as if
good
science
luck with
tells me
that.
not to murder.
Yeah.
Or not to steal.
Something else.
Or to love my neighbor. What are they talking about when they say science? How could that... What is the moral will of science?
Right. Science is necessarily subordinate to the ethic of inquiry.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. There shall not a hand touch it, but he shall surely be stoned. So you keep your paws off the sacred mount. That's basically the idea. Or shot through, whether it be beast or man, it shall not live. When the trumpet soundeth long, they shall come up to the mount. And Moses went down from the mount unto the people and sanctified them. And they washed their clothes. And he said unto the people, be ready against the third day. Come not at your wives. So that part of that process of sanctification is to control yourself for a while in the presence of the sacred. And it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled. So the revelation from above is preparing itself. Great imagery here. And Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the nether part of the mount. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, like a volcano, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. And when the voice of the trumpet sounded long and waxed louder and louder, Moses spake, and God answered him by a voice. And the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai, on the top of the mount, the peak of the pyramid, right? On the top of the mount. And the Lord called Moses up to the top of the mount, and Moses went up.
So remember now that everybody else, no one can touch the mountain. Everybody else who touches the mountain is killed. But Moses is called up.
Right, to the top.
To the very top.
Right,
yeah.
right. Yeah. That's quite a day for poor old Moses. And the Lord said unto Moses, go down, charge the people, lest they break through unto the Lord to gaze, and many of them perish. And the priests also, which come near to the Lord, sanctify themselves, lest the Lord break forth upon them. I think I mentioned in the seminar already one of Jung's dictum, which I just love. It was so enlightening to me. He said, the purpose of religious practice is to stop people from having religious experiences. So it's a container, right, to stop that.
Mediate is a better word.
Mediate. It is. It is. It was a joke. I mean, he didn't make jokes that often, but that was one, and it's a good joke. It's like, and no wonder. It's like, you want to have a religious experience, do you? Really? You really want that?
Is Jordan trying to convert the rest of you to Jung?
Only implicitly. he hid the fact that he was a Christian.
You said poor old
Even from
Moses,
himself.
so I have an interesting thought or question, really. I think about this a lot, and I don't have an answer. I think most people think, it's back to this miracle idea, but that if they had regular communion, definitive, and it wasn't in a dream, but as man speaks to man face to face, so Moses spoke to God. Don't most of us think if we had that, how happy we would be?
Yeah,
but I don't know if Moses was all
What's
that happy.
left of you would be happy. It's a little pile of dust about this high. It's
Right.
like-
Well, yes, that's if we saw
all
God,
the
we
rest
would
is burned
disintegrate.
away.
All right.
Yeah, it's
but
the burning away part is the annoying part.
But it is an interesting question. Why wasn't he happier? Even he wasn't allowed into the promised land, and it's a great lesson. None of us gets into our promised land, and I find great comfort in that.
Yeah, yeah.
But nevertheless, it is an interesting question for all of us who sort of bank everything on relationship with God. And as important as that is, it's not everything. It was a Protestant pastor whom I can never find his name, but when I cite it, I say it's not my own point. When God says it is not good for man to be alone with regard to Adam, some unknown pastor made this point. What was he saying? Among other things, I am not enough. Adam knew God. God spoke to Adam, and he's announcing it is not good for man to be alone. Well, he had God. And a lot of religious people think, oh, if I have God, I have everything. You
Kind of
have the most important thing, but you still don't have everything. We
not
need
much
each other. We need humans.
There's not much reason for the creation otherwise.
That's
is
right.
there?
Perfect. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So, and the priests also, which come near to the Lord, sanctify themselves, lest the Lord break forth upon them. And Moses said unto the Lord, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for thou chargest us, saying, set bounds about the mount, and sanctify it. And the Lord said unto him, away, get thee down, and thou shalt come up, thou and Aaron with thee. But let not the priests and the people break through to come up unto the Lord, lest he break forth upon them. So Moses went down unto the people, and spake unto them. And so Aaron gets to come up there too now. That's the line, right? Mm-hmm. And Aaron with thee. So the mediator, the political mediator to the people, is also, in this situation, allowed into the presence of God. As long as he's in also the
helper.
presence.
I mean, that's the way to. I tend to see Aaron as like the just a little bit lower than Moses.
Right.
Like he's the one who distributes him.
He's really a priestly figure, I think.
Because Moses at this point is like beyond a priest. Like he's
right.
I mean, he's
No,
not
he's
a
a prophet. He's
yeah,
a
exactly.
a mediator,
Yeah.
and
He's
Aaron's being
Aaron's
prepared
line will
for
become the priestly
high
line.
priest.
He becomes the
Yeah.
high priest. But Moses is like he's beyond that.
But he's being positioned for that.
Yeah.
All right, so on to Exodus 20. Now, I'm going to start by just reading through all of it, and then we'll recapitulate where we've been as we're drawing to a close the first half of the Exodus seminar, and then we can pick up with a detailed discussion of the law. And we'll do that when we reconvene in January, and that'll be part 2 of this seminar. And so let's walk through this. So God has revealed himself on the mount in thunder and lightning and drama, and now the revelation is being differentiated and made into words. And God spake all these words, chapter 20, verse 1. And God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. And all the people saw the thunderings and the lightnings and the noise of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they removed and stood far off. And they said unto Moses, Speak thou with us, and we will hear. But let not God speak with us, lest we die. And Moses said unto the people, Fear not, for God is come to prove you, and that his fear may be before your faces, that ye sin not. And the people stood afar off. And Moses drew near unto the thick darkness where God was. And the Lord said unto Moses, Thus thou shalt say unto the children of Israel, Ye have seen that I have talked with you from heaven. Ye shall not make with me gods of silver, neither shall you make unto you gods of gold. An altar of earth thou shalt make unto me, and shalt sacrifice thereon thy burnt offerings, and thy peace offerings, thy sheep, and thine oxen. In all places where I record my name, I will come unto thee, and I will bless thee. And if thou wilt make me an altar of stone, thou shalt not build it of hewn stone. For if thou lift up thy tool upon it, thou hast polluted it. Neither shalt thou go up by steps unto mine altar, that thy nakedness be not discovered thereon. Well, that's Exodus 20. And that brings us to the close of the first half of this seminar. And so we might recapitulate where we've been. Well, we've been studying, and please don't hesitate to jump in, gentlemen. We've been studying the great book of Exodus. It begins in the kingdom of stone in Egypt. And the Israelites, who are those who struggle with God, are laboring under the dominion of the Pharaoh. And that's posited in the narrative as something that is not meet and good in and of itself. And so that's the first moral claim in some sense of the Exodus book, is that the proper place for those who struggle with God and who are thereby favored by God is not under the dominion of a secular authority, a tyrannical secular authority. That is not the proper place to dwell. And that the Spirit of God itself is that which opposes the dominion of the ultimate secular authority properly, and more, that calls to those who struggle with God, even against their own fear, even against their own sense, in some sense, that they're to take the risk and to move out of the tyranny into the wilderness of God. Even if that's a desert, even if they face terrible privations in doing so, even if that's not sensible, there's no excuse not to do it, no matter what the excuse is. And you see too with the Passover that they're enjoined to do that, to be ready to do that at a moment's notice and in haste when the call comes. And it's so interesting that the spirit of, at least the spirit that strives against tyranny, is to be held as sacrosanct by those who properly wrestle with God. It's an amazing idea in that narrative. And then we also saw that the Egyptians aren't called out of the tyranny into freedom. It's not, let my people go, which is always how it's represented, almost. It's let my people go so they may serve me in the wilderness. And so, after great resistance on Pharaoh's part and much hemming and hawing on the part of the Israelites, they're encouraged to depart, and they don't go from Egypt to the promised land. They go from Egypt to the desert, and the desert's a terrible place. Even before they get to the desert, they're threatened by the resurgence of pharaonic might and the probability that they're all going to die as a consequence of their presumption that freedom should be sought. And even in that situation, what's held up in the highest place is the spirit that calls them forward. And then they end up in the desert and begin to organize themselves. And they organize themselves first dangerously under the sole dominion of Moses, and they're warned against that. And then they're enjoined to produce a hierarchical state, and then to prepare themselves for the revelation of the law. And then God organizes himself on the mountain. They come to the foot of the mountain. That's a symbol, at least in part, of the structuring of the proper hierarchy between heaven and hell. God prepares himself in thunder and lightning to reveal the nature of the divine law. And then he calls Moses and reveals the law. And then Moses describes it to the people. And that's really where we're at now. We'll pick up in a few months with a walkthrough of each of the commandments, because each of them deserve their careful attention.
There's
Closing
one more
comments,
thing I
Jonathan?
think that Audrey brought up, which is very important in this case, is that this is done through, it's almost, you can think of it almost like a relationship between God and his bride would be a way to think of it, where there's a consent, that God doesn't just impose himself. He will, like, it will become difficult for the Israelites, but it's because, do you want to do this? Like, do you want to worship me and to be my people? And the answer was yes. Mm-hmm. And so that is this beautiful.
It has to be voluntary.
It has to be voluntary, and it really is like from the beginning of Scripture. The difference between God did not create us as robots. God created, and that's even why Adam and Eve can fall in the garden, is because God wants our consent.
It's a call.
That's a call.
It's a call. Yeah. Okay, and the desire on the part of the Spirit that's calling people out of tyranny is the desire for voluntary movement out of tyranny.
Has to be answered.
Right. Oz, anything to say to wrap up?
No, I think we've come to the heart of it.
Yeah.
The Jewish notion, liberation, the covenant, and I love the fact that the Torah, people say the law, and it is law, but actually doesn't it mean instructions?
That's what it means.
And I think sort of operating instructions,
right?
It's a
rather than
it's a word
forbiddings.
closer to wisdom. You know, the word law is so often legalism.
Right.
No, it's
An
not
inhibition
coercion.
rather than
There's the consent, and it's wise operating
more like rules of a game than things you
Exactly.
can't do. Yeah, rules of the proper game.
But then
Yeah.
the big mystery one, the third one, the tent of meeting, and how we in our lives live meeting with God. That's the question you raised, Dennis.
James?
Well, might just say that really what we've come, as Oz says, to the heart of the matter, as we might say, right at the top of the top of the mountain, an appropriate place for a cliffhanger, you might say. And it's God speaking. The chapter opens God speaking all these words. And I think we're meant to think back immediately to the beginning of Genesis. We're invited, I think, again, I've said this before in the seminar, Jonathan said it a number of times, that we're invited to see creation in through, as it were, two lenses, as a kind of stereoscopic sound, that there's the order of nature that God brings into being in Genesis, and then he is, as it were, revealing and bringing, casting into relief the moral reality, the fabric of moral reality. These two are together. Science, as we might think, uncovers the natural world, and morality, the conscience, discerns the fabric of moral reality. And so I think...
So you have here too, with God using the word on Mount Sinai, the use of the word to bring into being, out of the potential of the Israelites, the order that is good.
That's right.
That pertains to the operating principle idea too.
Yeah.
So,
it's speech, logos, that is the animating principle. And of course, for Christians, that has profound Christological resonances, and that is what I think the opening of the Gospel of John is recapitulating, not just the opening of Genesis, but the opening of this chapter too.
Yeah. Larry.
This is the God who claims to be the one God and the maker of everything. And this is the greatest revelation I know of what our relations with him might be like if we meet up. For Christians, that's amplified and deepened in the New Testament. But here, this is just awesome. And it's awkward. It's difficult right from the start. And the reason is we're meeting perfection, and it pleased him to make us, and we're not perfect. Pleased him to make us imperfect so that we could judge and be a different kind of relation to him than anything else. And so how this all works is getting worked out here for the first time.
Could I add something?
Yes.
Rodney Stark says monotheism, the single most innovative idea in human history. And about the same time, Gore Vidal gave a lecture at Harvard and said that monotheism is the great unmentionable evil at the heart of the American experiment. And you have these dramatically different views.
Yeah, well, if you confuse monotheism with domination and power, then that's exactly what you do. That's what you presume.
But for him, any idea like that is wrong.
Anything that challenges.
I think we have the stark choice.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Dennis?
To 3 quick points. Your point about it is not just liberation, it is so that they will serve me, worship God. So I don't think this is well known to anyone outside of Judaism, unless they're truly a student of the Bible. There is one of the 613 laws of the Torah is that the Jew must count with a blessing using God's name every day from the first night of Passover until Pentecost, the receiving of the law. That's 49 days. It's 7 weeks. That's why the holiday is called weeks. Pentecost means, I think, in Greek, what is it, 50 days? Is it right? So it's the 50th day. In other words, getting out of Egypt without going to Sinai is useless. Mm-hmm. So that's
just stuck in the desert.
Just stuck in the stuck in the desert.
Yeah,
Point number 2 is a downer. It is terribly painful to me that the Bible is not taught outside of narrow religious circles anymore. You couldn't.
We're doing something about that.
We
right
are
now.
indeed. We are indeed. God bless you. That's right. Do you know that you could not get a BA at Harvard until 1800 if you didn't know Hebrew? Mm-hmm. Isn't that amazing? And the third is sounds self-serving, but I'll risk it. If the things that I have said and others have said here move people, I hope they will read my commentary on the Torah, the Rational Bible. Exodus is one of the 3 volumes that are now out, and I pray to live through the next 5. Leviticus will be a very serious challenge.
So people waiting for the next tranche of these seminars can do some background reading.
That would be great.
That'd be very useful.
Thank you.
Dr. Blackwood, what have you got to say?
Well, I've been thinking as we've been reading and rereading this text, which I've been reading for 40 years or so, that it really is about revealing the fundamental structures of reality. And I think where I want to close this moment is with this profound image that it's in the wilderness that God is revealed. And I want to say that because I think we are living in a wilderness, the civic alienation and rising depression, broken families, a wasteland of architecture, failing things that with the individual and within our states and our world, the ideology of power that is so corrosive and destructive and demeaning and diminishing. And yet, perhaps that wilderness is an index of our closeness to revelation. And I guess I just want to speak to the listeners and say, if you're hungry, you're longing for home, for an answer, for revelation, I would say, attend to this text and see whether it actually can be a kind of exodus or revelation of the way of let's say, liberation for you. Here's hoping that that this conversation, however much we all don't understand, I'm so deeply aware of how little I see here and how limited even a gathering of 16 hours can be in relation to such an infinitely rich text. Nonetheless, my hope, you might say my prayer, is that it's
a mountain in the desert.
It's a mountain in the desert.
Mr. Pajot.
I mean, first of all, I want to thank everybody, and I've been really amazed at the conversation and the amount at which we're able to dive into the text and look at everything. And I think that my hope and I think my joy as I see where we are is I really hope people come to see, and I think that's your hope as well, Jordan, that the things that Exodus are describing, although they might seem idiosyncratic at the first glance, they might seem strange and odd from people that were there a very long time ago, are describing things which are absolutely inevitable and that are as relevant to us right now as any psychology, any cognitive science, any theory of evolution, or any of these theories, that what Exodus and Genesis and Exodus and the books of the Bible are offering are really the best frame through which to look at reality, and that people can slowly get a sense of that and realize that this text it's inevitable.
No, I think all of you have done a wonderful job in elucidating that evidentiarially, let's say, right? And to guide people through a text like this to say, well, look, here's what it may mean insofar as we're able to penetrate it. And isn't that useful in 15 different ways, many of which you didn't expect? And we've all had the opportunity to experience that and then to share it and to build our mutual knowledge in this dialogical process. We're thrilled, by the way, that all of you who are watching and listening are watching and listening. I mean, we're doing this firmly with the fact of a receptive audience in mind and really a deep appreciation for that receptive audience, hoping to bring the best to you. And so I would like to thank all of you for coming. It's really something that this was aggregated. It's very unlikely that this will be the case, that we could do this. And I would like to thank the Daily Wire crew for all the work they did in making this possible, all the hospitality that they laid out and the care they took with everyone and their willingness to take a major risk on a project like this, which is so preposterous, and to have the faith necessary to make it happen, and then to double its length, because we thought we might manage this in this first series of seminars, but we're not going to rush because this is important. And so thank you to all of you. To all of you who've participated, it's been a great honor to be here. And that's that till January. So thank you, gentlemen, very much. Yep.
It's an honor to be with you.
Yeah. Awesome.